Welcome to Academy Dialogues. It starts with us. My name is Sean Finney. We are continuing our series of conversations about race, ethnicity, history, opportunity, and the art of filmmaking hosted by the Academy. Today's topic is owning our stories. We're incredibly honored to have Bird Runningwater, director of Sundance Institute's Indigenous Programs, moderating our conversation today. Joining Bird are screenwriter Misan Sagay, writer, director, actor Elle-Máijá Tailfeathers, writer, producer Ligiah Villalobos, and writer, director, producer Lulu Wang. Here's a little background on each of our speakers. As director of the Sundance Institute's Indigenous Programs, Bird oversees the Sundance Native Filmmakers Lab, the Native Producers Fellowship, and the festival's Native Forum. A native of the Cheyenne and Mescalero Apache tribes, Bird has been with Sundance for the last 10 years, supporting the buildup of a global indigenous film community. He is skilled in leading panel discussions and workshops around the world and has worked with major institutions, including the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations. He holds degrees in journalism, public affairs, and Native Studies. In fact, he was the first graduate of the Native American Studies program at the University of Oklahoma. Misan is a native of Nigeria who was raised in England and amazingly had a career as an emergency room doctor before becoming a screenwriter. She wrote the script for the 2013 movie Belle, about the daughter of an enslaved African woman and a British admiral set in 1700s British society. Her credits also include the teleplay for the Oprah Winfrey produced movie Their Eyes Were Watching God, and co-writer for the six-part series Gorilla, starring Idris Elba and produced by John Ridley, the writer of 12 Years a Slave. Elle-Máijá Tailfeathers is a rising filmmaker who is bringing compelling, authentic stories about indigenous people to the screen. She comes from Sami, the indigenous territory of the Sami people in Northern Europe. She is also part of the Kenai First Nation Blackfoot Confederacy. Her films include the multi-awarded documentary short, Rebel, which is autobiographical, and the feature, The Body Remembers When the World Broke Open, which she co-wrote, co-directed, and acted in. It premiered in 2019 at the Toronto Film Festival, receiving 3 awards, including Best Picture and at the Berlin Film Festival. Ligiah Villalobos has had a long career as both studio executive and a filmmaker. Her many film credits include writing and executive producing the independent feature La Misma Luna, also known as Under the Same Moon, writing the film Firelight, produced by Alicia Keys and Mary Martin, and consulting on Pixar animated features including Coco. Firelight was nominated for an NAACP Image Award and received a 2013 Humanitas Prize. Lulu Wang first gained international attention for writing and directing Posthumous in 2014, and then again in 2019 for her second feature, The Farewell, which she wrote, directed, and co-produced. The Farewell follows struggling New York City artist Billy, played by Awkwafina, who travels to China to visit her dying grandmother. Wang filmed The Farewell in the neighborhood where her own grandmother actually lived, and she cast her great aunt, Lu Hong, as herself in the film. Last year, Variety named Wang one of 10 directors to watch, and Awkwafina won a Golden Globe for her performance. The Farewell also won the Independent Spirit Award for Best Film. We look forward to hearing your conversation, everyone. Bird, take it away.
Thank you. And I want to thank everyone for joining us, especially our filmmakers, our screenwriters. I feel so honored to be here having a conversation with you. I myself am just kind of logging in essentially from Gabrielino Tongva lands and Tataviam lands, which Hollywood is built upon. I don't think that's a fact that's very well known within many communities, but I'm very honored to come here to you today. But I also have to mention that I myself descend from matrilineal and matriarchal indigenous nations. And so I feel very humbled myself to be speaking with such 4 powerful women such as yourselves. And I think the great voices that you bring to your work and to our screens and to audiences around the world. So I just want to first of all say thank you for what you give and what you do. I wanted to, just basically kind of start our conversation by, I guess, kind of asking you, I think as a point of view on our conversation, like, I wonder if somebody could kick us off just by telling us how they would kind of describe what they've defined as their own authentic voice that they're lending to their work. Does somebody want to kick us off with that? Lulu, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I think it took me a really long time. I think I'm still in the process of discovery of what that means to have a voice and to have a voice in your work. So for me, for a long time, it was finding the juxtaposition of pathos and humor, which for me is very much at the heart of my family, my culture, the way that I see the world, the way that my family has taught me to see the world. So humor was a big part of um, like finding the kind of humor in my work that I wanted to show was a big part of my process of of it landing, because humor is so specific to every culture and it may not be easily translatable. So that was a really difficult thing when I set out, especially to make the farewell, to say, oh, this is funny. And if someone goes, well, is it funny? And how do you like break that down, right? Because what someone finds funny, it just is. And so that was a big exploration of the particular type of humor. And especially with a visual medium like film, like for me, it was really a journey to figure out how to actually represent that kind of humor on screen so that it translates to not only like to audiences, but through multiple different cultures.
That's great. Thank you. Ligiah, what about you?
I think for me, the thing that I always have to keep going back and forth about um, is how I see myself on the inside, which is 100% Mexican, and how I need to see myself in the entertainment industry, which is as a Latina. And, for me, a Latina, the word Latino or Latinos, and now Latinx, for example, is not really a word that we ever use in the countries that we come from. We never say we're Latinos. We always say we're Mexican or we're Argentinian or we're Colombian or we're Brazilian. But in Hollywood, because we have so little power and because our stories are seen so rarely, a little bit more in television now, but almost non-existent in film, unless the movie is coming from another country. So I'm talking about the ability for us who live in this country to be able to tell our stories. That is almost non-existent in this country. The only way that we can sort of have some kind of power is by uniting with the word Latina or Latinx or Latino. But for me, I will always be a Mexican. That's how I see myself. That is my heart. And so it's navigating that back and forth and finding specificity so that we don't just see a Latinx character in television and film, but that we actually bring in the specificity of what that character may bring based on where they came from or, what their heritage is.
Right. Thank you for that. Misan, what about you?
I think what I've always wanted is to really expand what it means to be Black on screen. That I found very early on that we were, as a Black writer, I was only really allowed to inhabit quite, small spaces. That there was a lane that I was allowed to be in, which was about you look at the kinds of stories that I would be allowed to tell, and the kind of stories that Black people would be allowed to appear in. And I was very often told, when I was developing Belle, for example, they would say, "Oh, this just doesn't feel like a Black story because it's not, for example, urban enough. That it's not, or there would be a real focus on Black pain to the point that it almost becomes you say, what are you actually trying to say?" So I think it's to expand the kinds of stories we are allowed to tell, and stories that reflect the entirety of who we are as a people and as a race and as and to expand as well what people would expect to see when they look at a film with a Black person, and not be defined by the stories that people who, for whatever reason, those are the stories they feel comfortable for us to be in. That we need to, in the same way as in the greater society, we need to expand the spaces where people would expect to see us and not be uncomfortable. We need to have that on screen as well. And that has been my quest in defining myself as a storyteller, is to be able to tell my story and not the story you expect me to tell.
Right. Thank you for that. And you, Maya, how would you define your voice?
Well, I think as an Indigenous filmmaker, as someone who's Blackfoot and Sami, it's always about centering myself in my community and being responsible and accountable to my own community first and foremost, and thinking about my own people as my audience. To speak about that idea of expanding the types of stories that can be told, I think it's about thinking about the way that Indigenous people have been represented on screen since film first started rolling. It's been decades and decades of misrepresentation and of outsiders telling our stories. So for me, it's about always centering myself within my communities as an Indigenous person, and centering Indigenous people as my audience, and then I work from there.
Well, I think you might be being a little modest when you're saying decades of misrepresentation. I think it might be more like a century, perhaps.
Yeah, let's say century.
10 decades, let's say that. But I think all of us coming from the distinct communities that we're all coming from, I think we all share that in common. We all have that history of misrepresentation of our own peoples that I think definitely affects, our movement, our attempts to move within a particular industry and within, a world that I think kind of has preconceived notions of us. Misan, I heard you say in one of your lectures that you said the word diversity is complicated because in order for there to be diversity, you have to acknowledge kind of what the actual point of view is, and I think how would you describe the historical point of view that I guess we're challenging?
I think the point of view that normality is white, male, heterosexual, and that their stories are inherently interesting, and that that there needs to be no justification. You just have to be, and your story is interesting. And whereas to convince people that then I then have to be diverse from that. And once you say that, you're immediately saying that that is normal and my stories are not, and some accommodation has to be made in order to tell my story. And you can end up that telling my story is like castor oil. It's good for you, you got to do it, but actually it's not what you really, it's not pleasant, it's not the norm. And I think we need to get away from that. The white male that I've discussed at the beginning, and nothing against it, but the white it is diverse to me. So they shouldn't. So I'm not exactly. They are diverse to me, and the feeling that those stories are somehow inherently interesting, and our stories have to be justified. That is what I feel very strongly against, because to me, a lot of those stories are specifically not interesting. It depends where you stand before you find something interesting. And I'm worried about the use of the word diversity, because it entrenches a particular point of view that that is where we are looking from, and that all the rest of us are diverse. I worry about that as a concept.
Although, Misan, I have to say, I was recently putting together a writer's room, and I said, maybe we should get a white male in here in order to have diversity, because right now we have only women and women of color, and, we're not going to, and everyone said, we don't need that point of view. Everyone knows that point of view plenty fine, so we ended up not doing it.
I love that.
Well, I do believe that one of the things, we are commenting on is kind of like, who determines the frame, who determines what's centered, who determines the norm. But I think that one of the things we often don't, while we don't acknowledge that enough, I think also one of the things that it definitely leads to is, is creating bias. It creates historical bias against, all of us, who are, not represented in that norm or maybe misrepresented to that norm. But I just wondered if anyone had any ideas about what are some steps we can take to overcome that bias? Because I think we do see it, it's continually perpetuated.
Well, I would say one is education. I think that, like one thing that I always say, and I work much more in television than I work in feature, so I hope it's okay to talk a little bit about that experience in terms of feature. But, one of the things that I say, and I'm in the Equity and Inclusion Committee for the Writers Guild of America, and we have dealt with a lot of issues of not just sexual harassment, but harassment and racism in the writers' rooms. And, one thing that I always say is writers who get a show, for the most part, are being hired because they are talented writers. They are incredible storytellers. They are not getting hired because they have leadership skills. But they are put in positions where they have to be leaders of not only the writer's room, but an entire crew and a whole group of actors. And nobody has given them any kind of information or classes or leadership seminars of how do you run a crew of 300 people? What is acceptable behavior and not? What is considered racist or not? Who can help you navigate these worlds and these stories and these people? And so now more than ever, I think it's super important because we no longer just have 4 networks with 30 shows being put on the air every year. We have dozens of cable networks and streaming services in addition to network television. We have 500 shows in production a year. So we have a whole generation of writers that are being put in these positions with absolutely no knowledge of how to lead. And so a lot of the issues that I think we see, also in feature sets, by the way, because it's not like directors are giving leadership skills either, but more so I think in television because there's just so many shows that are being produced a year that I think it's vital to, as part of getting hired, that you are actually receiving information and training on these issues, as well as just leadership, some leadership skills that can guide you through a process of running a room and beyond.
Yeah. I think that's important. I agree with the issue of training because one of the things about, I think Elle-Máijá has a really interesting story of when she was co-directing her first feature, she did a particular level of training with her crew and with actors and with communities and everybody who was really involved in the creation and the production of her feature film. Can you describe that a bit much? Because it was more like around what you would call, I guess you said, cultural competency. Is that correct?
Yeah. So who is behind the camera absolutely shapes the narrative. And within the Indigenous film community, we have quite a few really talented writers and directors and producers, but we don't have enough people working in the technical departments. We don't have enough people working as sound recorders, editors, all of those things. And who makes up a crew absolutely influences the story that you're telling. And so as an Indigenous filmmaker, I thought it was so crucial that we hire as many Indigenous people within our crew, especially in those key technical positions. But what we're recognizing is that there aren't enough of us to be working on all the films that are being made right now. And so we took a twofold approach. One was that we recognized that we had to hire a lot of non-Indigenous crew members who were lovely people. But there's a lot of work to do in terms of unlearning colonialism, unlearning this complicated narrative that we're all sitting in, and finding new ways of moving forward. So what we did was we held a mandatory cultural competency training and Indigenous history training for our entire crew before we went into production, which in a way was to sort of ground everybody in a place of respect and understanding that we have a lot of work to do together. And then the second thing that we did was that we hired 11 Indigenous youth, young people wanting to work in film in all of the key technical departments in order to build capacity, in order to move forward and to understand that one key way of dismantling these systems of oppression and systems of power that really shape the kinds of stories that are being told on screen is to build capacity within the Indigenous film community itself.
Thank you. I think that's such an interesting model to contemplate. I think because if we have to acknowledge, I think in this moment in time, I think given our pandemic and given, the state-sponsored terrorism that's happening against Black people in our country, it's like we're starting to recognize, these systems of power and white supremacy that exist not only in our political systems in our country, but I definitely think that exist within our industry. And I think, and if we're gonna continue to, have an impact and to create change, I think those systems need to be, questioned more, and that people need to be trained more. Lulu, you were just talking about, having staffed a writer's room. Can you describe kind of like how we all should be getting into the room? Like, how did you get into the room in order to get to this point where you are?
I mean, honestly, I've never written in a room before, so I was told by a couple of my writers. They said, this is unlike any room I've ever experienced, and I think in some ways because I didn't experience the hierarchy and sort of the abuse that's so common in writers' rooms, I didn't know to bring. I said, we're a team. Here's a group of people who have very different backgrounds, very different experiences, who are all tremendously talented. So why wouldn't we just talk about everything? I had to actually teach some of the writers who have been in a lot of rooms and rooms where they're not allowed to speak up. They would one woman kept raising her hand. I was like, why are you raising your hand? Just talk, and so it is so strange to kind of realize, like, here I am the showrunner and I don't have experience in a room. So I would often turn to her and say, having been in rooms, how is this normally done? And then in other ways, it was just organic. It's just like, you learn to be friends, you ask each other for their perspective, and it always made the story better. Always, right? Like, I think when people are fearful and they don't give their perspective, that's not helping the show. That's gonna hurt me and the show. If someone says, actually, I have the same background as this character, this is not how we would say things, I'm like, please, please, please tell me, like, do you want to take a look at it? Do you want to take a pass? Like, like, call your father. What would he say? Like, all of those things are what make the story rich and authentic. So I don't know why any showrunner would ever want to keep people from, expressing that. Like, that's just purely ego, and it's stupidity.
I agree. Well, Misan, you came from a background of being, I believe, a doctor, and were you a surgeon as well?
Yeah, I
before
was
you became
critical care, emergency room.
Oh, critical care before you became a screenwriter. What was that path like? I think, ultimately getting to, have your feature films produced and made and shared, and there obviously was a journey there, and you had to get into those decision-making rooms. How did you do that?
Well, how I came into screenwriting actually dovetails very, very well with this conversation we're having today. I went to the cinema and I watched a film, and it was a film about slavery, and there were no black people in it. It was one of these stories where we knew slavery was appalling and terrible because the white wife of the white male character kept having her dinner parties disrupted by his zeal to end slavery. And I just didn't see any black people. And I felt that I never saw myself. That if cinema is really, it's like the home movie of the world, isn't it, really? It's where we go and we see ourselves, and we're not there. And when we are there, we're horribly misrepresented. And that you don't know, you sit there sort of balancing between the thrill of seeing yourself and the embarrassment of how you're portrayed, you know? And I just got to the point where I thought I just wanted to see something that I would want to see. I wanted to see myself, and I wrote a screenplay. It may seem sort of rather an odd thing to do, but as a doctor, obviously you tell stories all day, so it isn't as far a journey. But it was a desperate, yearning need to see myself represented on screen in a way that I recognized. And I think that that many of us feel that it's like looking at, it's like being a member of a family. I said this before, and you're watching the home movies of the family and you're not there. You're not there. You've been excluded, and you go, well, why? And so that was how I started, and that was the beginning of my journey to write.
And I imagine you had to deal with many gatekeepers, which is actually meant to be the thrust of our discussion today. Because I think we recognize that there are decision makers. There are gatekeepers. There are the ones who are kind of who make the decisions to, I guess, allow some of us in. Ligiah, what has been your experience in navigating the gatekeeping, I guess, of the industry?
Well, I also didn't start as a writer. I actually started as an executive. So I was an executive in television, and I was also an executive in features. I worked within a studio system, and I also worked within a network system. And in every case, I was the only Latina. And sometimes I was the only Latina on the entire floor, not just even in my apartment, but the entire floor. And so I always felt I had a responsibility in those positions to make sure that the shows that I was overseeing, or the movies that I may be doing, had representation, which wasn't the case. So I understand it from that side, and I understand the importance of having executives of color and producers of color in those positions that might help us get through the door, right? Because I have been that person. At the same time, I think that a lot of what could help is for networks and for studios to actually have a mandate. And I know they hate that word, and I know that they hate using that because they feel like, no, we just need to allow the filmmaker to be able to tell the stories that they want to tell and work in their creative environment or whatever. And I'm all for that. But I think that a lot of this has to come from the top. They have to understand that we are so far behind where we need to be in terms of what the studios and networks are representing in television and what the world actually looks like. That unless they really start mandating certain things, I'm not sure things are going to change drastically. But for me, I just feel like I try to tell the best stories that I can. One way that I have been able to navigate this is that I never set out to only be a network writer, or I never set out to be only a feature writer. Like I will only do features, or I will only work in network television, which is not even a thing anymore, right? Because there's so many streaming services. But at the time it was. So the way that I have navigated this bias is for me not to think of myself as just like I will only do primetime television, or I will only do features. That was never really the way that I thought about my career. when I transitioned from being a studio and network executive to being a writer, one of the reasons why I did that is because I wanted to have control over the stories that I was putting out into the world, which I really didn't as a network or a studio executive, right? So when I made that transition, I decided if somebody wants to tell the story in preschool animation, I will do it in preschool animation. If somebody wants to do this as an MOW, meaning movie of the week, for Hallmark Hall of Fame, which is how I did the Alicia Keys project, Firelight, I will do it in television and for Hallmark Hall of Fame. You know, so allowing myself the opportunities that go beyond where you really usually think of, like where your story should be told. It's a way that I have been able to navigate this bias, that I have gone from working on an NBC show to working on Go Diego Go. And that was a preschool show on Nickelodeon. And everybody said, you cannot take that job. You cannot do that job because you will never make it back to network television. And I thought to myself, how do I say no to a show that is going to have a Latino lead, that is going to teach kids Spanish and the importance of science? Like, I literally could not see a downside to that. And then I went from that to releasing La Misma Luna, which Fox Searchlight bought. So a lot of this for me was like, I can't worry about what people may think because I'm working in preschool TV, or am I doing a cable movie instead of a feature film? I just want to work at the places that are willing to tell my stories. And so instead of always thinking about, oh, this story's never going to be able to be told, no, I just go to the places that are willing to tell the kinds of stories that I want to do. And that has helped me not go crazy and not to think about the negative aspects of what we do. But like I said earlier, until the top and the CEOs at these companies really try to create some sort of mandate for what needs to happen, I'm not sure how much is going to change.
Thank you for that. I think you've been a master at the navigation, obviously. I wonder, does anybody else have any comments, I guess, about gatekeeping and gatekeepers and how they've had to
Can I say one more thing? Do you
Please.
mind if I just say one more thing? I think that the most powerful thing that I have ever done in my career is to have the courage to speak up. So a job was never worth me not speaking up. And I think a lot of us, because we are the only ones in the room, whether it's a writer's room or we're only in an executive position, or we're the only ones that are getting like the one Latino movie done in the next 3 to 5 years, that sometimes we're too afraid to say something. And I think that one thing, and you know, I'm old enough that maybe that's given me the courage, but I was like this when I was in network television and I had to speak up. You know, we had a show taking place in Miami and there were no Latinos, not even in the background. And I was like, you can't do a show in Miami without any Latinos, not even on the background. Like there were positions that I took and continue to take that I think are really important for those of us who are working and for those of us who are able to develop and create programming, that our voices need to be heard. Like one thing that I'm very clear about when I go in, especially in children's programming, where a lot of times they're trying to make everybody just be like everybody else, I always say a character cannot be replaceable or interchangeable if it's a character of color.
Yes.
So I don't want you to just be able to put anybody else in that role. And I know that there's a way, and you know, some people do that. But for me, being able to say that and then being clear, it's like, if you're going to develop with me, this is the person that you're actually going to get. And you cannot assign me a composer because you have been working with that composer for the last 10 shows that you did. You have to ask me if I have an opinion about a composer of color that I might want to use instead of the white composer that you have been using for the last 20 years. Like being able to empower yourself as a creator of color and not allow these things to continue because you're afraid that your show is not going to make it on the air. Unless we speak up, these things are going to continue. So the way that I see it is, even if let's suppose that I'm fired, which hasn't happened that often, by the way, but let's suppose that I am fired. I can promise you that that executive or that producer is not going to forget that conversation. And that might bring change to somebody else in another project that is not even related to me, because they're always going to remember the outspoken Ligiah Mexicana that came in here and told us, you cannot do this, right? And so I feel strongly that those of us who are working must have the courage to speak up in these situations.
Thank you.
And if I might say, I think also at this moment, one sort of feels exhausted by this process, and it's time to stop asking nicely as though we're asking for a favor, and try and change perception that what we are doing is just demanding normal rights, and not feel all the time that that one has to somehow persuade people, but rather that look at the wider society that's not going to, that will accept that, change things so that people accept that the present status quo is inherently wrong. And therefore, it's how are we going to put it right, not how are we going to have favors dispensed. Our stories matter, Black stories, Latina stories, Indigenous stories, our stories matter, our representation matter, our lives matter. And we need that to be, inherent, not just in our industry, but in the wider society, because people need to understand that the present status quo is unsustainable. And it is very difficult. I agree with Ligiah. Sometimes it's very difficult to speak out when you're a writer, and from my point of view, when you're getting notes which are just sort of, some notes can be just sort of horrendous, and you think, if I say anything, is it better if I'm working at it from the inside and all of that? And at just some point, once it's exhausted with it, and we just want to be, we need to be heard, and our stories need to be heard, and we can't do it alone without the wider society accepting and understanding that the current status quo is unsustainable and unacceptable.
Yes. Lulu, can you share us a point of view on navigating with this world with gatekeepers and your talent?
Yeah, I think, one of the things I tell so many filmmaker friends of mine who are women of color is, we talk a lot about, like, do you build your own table? Do you try to get a seat at the table? We have these debates of, like, we just gotta say, forget the system and just build our own table. But, you have to have the numbers, you have to have power in order to go and build a table. And, the generations that came before us, they didn't have that choice. They had to find a seat at the table and ask to be let in order to build their clout, their, whatever reputation, all of it, in order to go and maybe create their own table. And so I think that for me, I have to take this perspective of abundance, where, which is something that we all have to unlearn, of not thinking of ourselves as special or singular and there's only room for one, because as everyone comes up, that's how we, have more power, create, those are the people that you can turn to and say, well, because when you're there alone, it's terrible. You go, it's like, you don't know if you're crazy or they're crazy, right? Because they're convincing you that you're the one who's crazy. But if you have other people around who have this other perspective, it's just better. And so one of the things I talk about with these friends is transparency, where anybody who asks me, I'll show them my contracts. I ask friends of mine to show me their contracts. I think it's really important that we have comps with other filmmakers who have done a first feature, a second feature, or doing their first TV show, going, well, what did you make? And what rights were you given? Were you allowed to pick your DP? Were you allowed to pick the writers in your room? And, you know, so I always tell my friends not to get overly excited when they get offered a deal. Before you get excited, do your research. Talk to as many people as possible who have worked with this company. Find out how they treat people of color, how they treat both financially and creatively. And that way they are sort of armed with facts to go back to their reps to say, I'm not going to take this deal. I'm not going to come to the table and be grateful, which is what they're expecting, you know? And so I said, don't stop getting excited, stop being grateful, and make sure that they're actually valuing. Sorry, I just had a brain fart. They're actually giving, as much value as you deserve. And unfortunately, sometimes that means you have to say no. And that's something I talk a lot about as well, is the power of saying no. Because before I made The Farewell, I was just saying yes to everyone because I was so desperate to make a story, to make a film and get it out somehow. But there's such a emotional deficit. Like there's a payment that goes in. Nothing is for free. And so you might say yes to somebody and they turn your story into something else. You're not properly paid to do this work. You can burn out so quickly. And so I think that the importance of having the confidence and the value in your own work to say, I'm not going to do this work unless the proper conditions are met. Because I can't do my best work if these conditions are not met. And if I can't do my best work when the work comes out and people go, well, look, here's an Asian woman and we gave it a shot, we did this film but it failed, it's gonna be put on you. And so that's the first thing I say to anybody who works with me is like, if you value what I do, these are the terms in which I need to do my best work, including bringing my own collaborators who may not have the same credits, who you may not be as familiar with. But this is the organic process for me. And if I can't have my process, then you're not going to get the result that you're looking for.
Thank you. Elle-Máijá, I wanted to give you a chance to comment before we have to move on to questions.
Sure. Yeah, I just am loving listening to everybody. I really appreciate what Lulu said about this notion of abundance, about thinking differently about our stories, about stories that come from BIPOC communities, about stories that come from voices that have been marginalized or silenced or erased within the film world. And I really appreciate what she said about building a new process and about considering who these gatekeepers are. So when it came to The Body Remembers When the World Broke Open, it's a film about two Indigenous women in East Vancouver in Canada. It covers issues of domestic violence, and it's a bit of a heavy film, and we had a really hard time closing our financing gap, and we had a really hard time finding a distributor because people continually said this story is important. We understand it's an important story, but we don't know how we're going to market it. We don't know how we're going to sell this story. And we kept getting that same sort of response. And then the film got in front of Ava DuVernay and Telaine Jones at Array Releasing. And they decided to pick up the film, and that changed everything for us. And I think what that speaks to is the fact that when there are people who come from marginalized communities, who come from, who are BIPOC, in these positions of power, people who are able to shift the narrative and to show that there is an audience for films like mine and for the others on the panel, it changes everything. And so now that film is available on Netflix to such a broad audience. And what we're finding is that despite the fact that it's such a specific story about two Indigenous women, it has so many universal themes, and there's so many people who are drawn to the story on a personal level, who aren't Indigenous, who aren't from Canada. And so it really is about shifting who is in these positions of power. It's about making about holding gatekeepers accountable, and acknowledging that as long as there are, you know, straight cisgendered white men in positions of power deciding whose stories get told and whose don't, we're going to continue to see the same issues replicated, and the same voices being silenced. So I have so much gratitude for people like Ava and Tulane at Array, because they're just opening so many doors for voices like mine, and I think that really speaks to a brighter future for all of us. And I hope that this moment that we're experiencing right now, in terms of a reckoning with race relations in the United States and also in Canada, I hope that the work that's being done right now continues into the future. And I really hope we see lasting change and lasting accountability.
You know what? I also think it's important for artists who are not a person of color, for them to also be thoughtful about the projects that they take on. You know, are they asking the question when they are brought in to do a Latino story, have you met with Latino writers? Have you met with Latino directors? You know, that they themselves also look at this journey as their journey as well. And I think that everybody should be able to tell the stories that they want to tell. So I have a different opinion about, you know, a person who may be passionate about a story that they want to tell. I'm talking about dealing with these gatekeepers at the studios. If you are being brought in to do a story that is not really your own, are you asking questions yourself? So not just asking those questions. Like, it is so sad for me to know that there are two big Latino movies that are going to be released this year, and neither one is being directed by a Latino. You know, and thank God that one of them is directed by a person of color, but we are still having our stories told by non-Latinos. And so we have a responsibility to speak out, but I think hopefully the community as a whole is also speaking up about these issues and saying, who have you met on this? You know, it's so interesting. I think 4 of the last 6 Academy Awards for director have been given to a Mexican. But we still can't find directors that can direct the movies that the studios want to make about us. It's just the irony of it it's incredible to me.
I love that you're saying that. It's interesting, because I'm just thinking as a metaphor, as an analogy, like when we travel, at least when I travel, right? Or when I go out in LA to a restaurant, I'm like, oh, I want to eat. Let's go to that Vietnamese restaurant. It's full of Vietnamese people. Like, that's a good sign when it's filled with Vietnamese people, right? Or wherever, if you're traveling, you want to go to the local places, and you look to make sure that not only the people cooking, but the people eating are actually from that background. And it gives it legitimacy. And how do we not do that with movies? You know what I mean? Like, if I want to see a Mexican film, I want to make sure that the people cooking the meal and the people who are coming to the meal are giving it the validation, because that's saying to me that that's an authentic experience. So, and I talk a lot with friends about my experience when I get notes from people who don't come from my background. How do I say it, right? Like, how do I say, you don't get this because you don't get it, because you're not from where I'm from? And it took me a long time to actually find those words, because you still have to be polite. You can't just come straight out and be like, hey, if you don't let me do it, that's racist. Like, you can't really say that, right, to an exec. So, there's this diplomatic way of saying, I really respect your opinion, but I don't think this is a story no. I think this is a cultural no that you don't understand because you don't come from where I come from. And they really respond well. At least producers that I've worked with really respond well to that. But I think you're right, Ligiah. I wish that executives, producers, people who are working with creators that are from different backgrounds don't wait until they say to you, because that's a scary, it's a lot to carry, all of that pressure for them to come to you and say, hey, you don't come from where I come from. Like, you should recognize that and say that right up front and give them the space so that the creator can, point when something is a cultural difference and a perspective difference rather than a purely like technical craft note. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and also, like looking at your film, I was thinking about when I watched it, like sometimes, even though it is a cultural thing that like people may not understand, sometimes it is in the specificity that you find commonality. So I remember when I went to see your film, that whole cemetery scene with the crying and the food, and it was like, it's Dia de los Muertos for us. Like, it is crazy. And, I don't know if you guys know this, but Coco is the highest grossing Pixar movie in China. I think it made $200 million in China. And I was like, why? I wonder why Coco made so much money in China, right? And sometimes it's like Coco cannot be more specific. It is so specifically Mexican. But there's a whole group of people that saw this movie and found commonality in the specificity of it. And sometimes, what executives are really afraid of is the thing that they should fear the least. Because people will find their way through the movies. They will have some understanding. The same thing happened with Under the Same Moon in Jordan, where I was thinking, how are people going to relate to this in Jordan? Well, they were experiencing a huge amount of people coming in from Syria. And all of a sudden, there was so much commonality in that. And so I would hope that also it's something that they look at. That I saw your movie, Lulu, and I immediately connected with so many of the things, even though we could not be more far apart in terms of our cultures or our backgrounds.
Thank you.
I loved your movie as well. I think one of the things that exercises me is, how do we stop this being our problem? We have to overcome. How do we, because actually the reality is it is not our problem. It is it's the problem of the people around us. And how do we make sure that even the perspective from which we look at what has to be done, isn't just focused on us having to be super women or do this, and how do we overcome, but how do we change the conversation to, what are you doing? I mean, you are wrong, therefore how are we going to make you how are we going to involve you in the solution and not have it about us having to overcome you? How do you make you part of the solution? And I think that's when we talk about gatekeepers. Obviously having more diverse, I've used the word, gatekeepers is going to make a difference. But there's also that there is also the majority population, that they have to be part of this, and we can do things like making the sort of mandating things, as we discussed earlier. But there's also somehow that hearts and minds have to be changed. And that's what sort of exercises me, because people also have to be willing. Otherwise, what happens is that they'll make that. I remember being told, to a filmmaker here, oh, we already made a black film. They made one 3 years before, and, so that's that. As opposed to thinking, this is just normal. This is normal life, and this is just how the world, when I step foot outside my door, looks like, and this is what it should look like here, and I can understand that your stories are interesting to you, my stories are interesting to me. Let's make them all. That's what exercises me, is how do we stop approaching this as our problem and look at, and focus on, and also focus on how we can change, make it a wider society or wider problem within the industry, and not something that we have to overcome, but that there should not be that resistance in the first place. Maybe in utopia, but that's what I think we should be driving towards. It's exhausting when can I just say, when you go in and pitch a story, and the first half hour, you're not pitching your story, you're not pitching yourself, you're pitching your relevance. And I had a most wonderful sort of experience of pitching to an African American woman executive. And it was like, suddenly, it was like having the weights on your feet, the anvil that's been on your feet, gone, because I could suddenly just pitch my story, pitch what it was, without the sort of preamble. And it's how do we get there where there isn't that resistance in the first place, rather than us having to always be so special in order to be able to get through.
In Canada, we're kind of in this unique position, and we've sort of modeled what's happened in Australia and New Zealand in terms of Indigenous stories, Indigenous representation. Indigenous people are leading the conversation, and we're seeing that now in Canada. We have the Indigenous Screen Office, and a lot of work has been placed into developing something called the Pathways and Protocols document, and it's literally a guide for non-Indigenous people wanting to work with Indigenous communities, wanting to tell stories with Indigenous content. And it's in a lot of ways, it's a way of holding non-Indigenous people accountable, because it's trendy right now to tell Indigenous stories. Like every week I get multiple emails, multiple calls, requesting that I direct or help write the story that has an Indigenous character or Indigenous whatever. And it's such an incredible resource to have this Pathways and Protocols document to say, here, like, look at this document, read it. This is what you need to do. And these are the questions you need to ask yourself. Should you be telling this story? Are you the right person to tell this story? Have you connected with communities in a responsible, ethical, meaningful way? And if they haven't, they have that document to look to. And so I think we need to continue to move in that direction when it comes to telling all stories that are relevant or represent BIPOC communities or LGBTQ2S communities or just the disabled community. I think there needs to be some sort of these mandated documents in a way that serve us as a tool, because there's so much emotional labor, so much education that we have to do as the other when it comes to telling our own stories, and having that document, having that tool has been such a weight off my shoulders as an Indigenous storyteller. And I think it also protects our communities, because there's kind of this toxic form of extractive filmmaking that has existed since the cameras first started rolling. So people of color, Indigenous people, anybody who is the other has been fetishized or romanticized or misrepresented in front of the camera. And there's just so much work to do to unlearn all of that, to change all of those ways of operating. And when it comes to, like I said, this extractive form of filmmaking, it comes from people who are not from those communities, going in with a voyeuristic lens and getting it all wrong every single time. They always get it wrong. And so it needs to shift to us being the ones telling the stories, to us leading the conversation. And like I said, this Pathways and Protocols document has been such a lifesaver for me, and I think a lot of other Indigenous creatives.
I believe that we have to wrap up in order to ask a couple of questions. And so I'm going to hand it off to Sean to provide us with our questions.
Lulu, Bird, Ligiah, Misan, Elle-Máijá, what a beautiful conversation, and thank you for being so transparent. The Academy Dialogues was created as a platform to give our members an opportunity to have truthful, transparent conversations. And I wanted to ask you, what dialogue do you hope this conversation will inspire in others? We can start with you, Bird.
Oh, with myself. Well, I think so many things that I feel like our panelists spoke about today was really, I think, about the distinctness that their voices is lending, I think, to the form, the form of storytelling, the forms of storytelling, form of cinema, but also that there are audiences who are hungry for it, but there's a disconnect between the stories they're trying to tell and what the audience wants, and I think that is our industry. And I think that our industry could be a lot more bountiful and successful if these voices were really supported and really brought to the screens for these hungry audiences to experience and to share.
Thank you. Lulu, what dialogue do you hope this conversation will inspire in others?
I think that around what we were saying of putting the pressure, putting the responsibility on the gatekeepers themselves, the executives, so that, the writers, the directors are not always the ones having the conversation ourselves to say, how do we, better this situation, that hopefully the members will talk more and look at their own position in the industry and their own power and say, what are the questions that I can do better? What also, how do I better educate myself so I can participate and be part of the solution?
Elle-Máijá, what about yourself?
Oh, wow. This has been such a rich conversation. And I think ultimately, I hope viewers and Academy members especially walk away and take time to consider how we're all implicated in this narrative, how we move together, how we move forward together, and how can we dismantle these toxic systems of working, and how can we build a new way forward? How can we build models that are rooted in equity and respect and accountability? And how can we build models of working that are generative and consider a future that doesn't necessarily reflect our present moment, where we're having to have this kind of conversation. I really hope that in 10 years from now, we're not having to have the exact same conversations.
Misan and Ligiah, you both represent flexibility. Everyone does, but you all specifically, because Misan, you came from being a doctor before. Ligiah, you spoke about being an executive. For new filmmakers that are coming up, how important is it to be flexible with going after your dreams and your passions?
I think, from my point of view, it's less about being flexible than about having, confidence that what I often find, I sometimes mentor beginning writers of color, and they censor themselves so much. They go, "Oh, am I ready? Can I do it?" There are certain. We all know that. That there are people from the sort of the wider community who've walked past a film set and they're ready to direct a Marvel movie, Whereas as a woman and as a woman of color, you'll say, "Oh, am I ready?" So it's less about being flexible than about saying, "Yes, having a go." And from the other side, it's about not having everything on the shoulders of one black filmmaker, so that if that black filmmaker has a go, and it isn't perfect, there isn't any bigger conversation about, "Oh, well, we've done our black and it was a disaster, we're not going to do it again," or making each person representative of everything as opposed to just them just trying to make their film. So I think that's what I hope people will take away from this, that we have sort of rich stories to tell, that we're an asset. We're not a problem to be solved. We're an asset, and that we should be allowed to try and allowed to to participate without the huge amount of pressure that can be on somebody, and that while we should be flexible, we should also ourselves just be more not self-censor all the time and feel that, you know, I just need to, or be worried about the consequences, and those consequences should not be disproportionate to making a film. It works, it doesn't work, it doesn't have to be everything, so that the pressure becomes too difficult.
Thank you so much. And Ligiah, did you want to add to that?
Sure. So I heard a quote once that said, "A nation is only as great as its dreams, and dreams are dreamt by artists." Now, I have no idea who originally said that. I heard that from Tom Cruise on the Actors Studio, and it has stuck with me since that interview. So what I would say to that new generation of filmmakers, writers, artists is, especially in the world that we're living in, your voices and your stories are vital to our survival. To our survival. The second thing I would say, though, is I heard a statistic that less than 50% of Americans actually have a passport, which I think is a disgrace. And even a much, much, much lesser percentage of them speak a second language. So when you think about the most powerful country in the world delivering the most powerful content to the world, and less than 50% of us have actually traveled, our stories become so much more vital, because it is sometimes the only window that the audience in this country has about the outside world. And if you want to know why this country is where it is because people don't leave this country. They're not experiencing what is happening in the world. So just imagine how important our stories and our point of view is in trying to change the perception of who we are in the world and who the world is. And that's why I think it's so important that our stories are told and heard and considered.
Wow, Ligiah, thank you so much for that beautiful answer. Bird, Lulu, Misan, and Elle-Máijá, thank you so much for your time and for participating in Academy Dialogues. And on behalf of the entire Academy, thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for
Thank you
having
very
us.
much.